have a 101 topic on passive samplers and how to use them from David Alvarez, the USGS. And in July, we're going to get a little bit technical with some statistics. So how can we move beyond p-values in NRD statistics? And that's going to be led by Richie Erickson of USGS. And we don't have a topic for August yet. We may take a little break. But in September, we're going to have one of our solicitors, Amy Horner-Hanley, talk about addressing the question, do I need more science to build my claim? So that should be exciting too. Hopefully you guys can tune into that. If you're not on the email distribution list, you can contact Samantha Foster. And if you have any topic ideas, you can always drop them in the chat or shoot me an email. And then we have our disclaimer at the bottom that talks about the finding and conclusions are not representative of the DOI NRDA program, and so forth. So I'll let you read that. And as I'm going to stop sharing my screen here in just a moment, and I will go off camera, I did just want to say that, again, my thanks to Peter for agreeing to talk about this particular topic. And this topic actually came about from the 2020 tribal workshop that the DOI NRDA program hosted with many of you attendees. And there was this request to have this topic. And so I'm just appreciative of Peter agreeing to give this presentation. And so I am going to stop sharing my screen. And as I do that, Peter, you can go ahead and share yours. And I'm just going to give your short bio. So Peter Mahoney is a Coeur d'Alene tribal member with a bachelor's degree in general studies. Prior to working for the Coeur d'Alene Tribal Lake Management Department, Peter worked in the fields of traditional physical activities and diabetes prevention. And his fun fact, which we like to ask for, is that Peter is one of 3 Coeur d'Alenes that have helped build a traditional sturgeon nose canoe. So that sounds interesting. I'm not for sure I know what that all looks like. Maybe that has to do with the carving of the canoe. Peter, maybe you can explain that to us if we have time later. So with that, Peter, I see your slides and you should be good to go.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Joe. Hisquist qua Peter Mahoney, chins chits ulf Lakota, chin shannon twa jot elet management, stamilguis, hinunet qua Peggy Mahoney, hin pipet qua Pete Mahoney, hin chichayat qua Marlene Means, and hin kinet qua Edith Zachary. Hello, my friends. My name is Peter Mahoney. I'm a Coeur d'Alene tribal member. I'm also of Lakota descent on my mother's side. I work for the Coeur d'Alene tribe in lake management. I also wear different hats for the tribe. I serve on our health authority board, which helps oversee policy within our clinic, Mariman Health. And I also serve the tribe on our natural resources committee. My Stimilguis, my family, my mother is Peggy Mahoney, my father is Pete Mahoney, my mother's mother was Marlene Means, and my father's mother was Edith Zachary. I'm super excited to be here presenting to you guys today on the topic of traditional cultural knowledge and how it amounts to the exact same thing as science. And it's really applicable to teaching in classrooms, and it all just depends on the lens that you frame your perspective with. That's where I definitely see the connection between our traditional knowledges and our traditional teachings and science as it's taught in schools today. So on the right there, we have our Coeur d'Alene tribal seal, and in the center, we have a picture of our beautiful lake, Lake Coeur d'Alene, and one of our younger tribal members is paddling a sturgeon nose canoe. That canoe was used by our people for thousands of years. That one right there has ballistic nylon wrapped around the outside, but historically we would have used the bark of a white pine tree. So some things I want you to think about as we're going through the presentation today. Number one is how indigenous perspectives can differ from other like Western perspectives. The thought that none of us can change history, but we can use it to dictate how we move forward together with different tribal communities.